Hey everybody, my name is George Rice and I'm the Food Policy Director for the City of Madison. I wanted to give a brief presentation on the seed grants program for the City of Madison so that interested applicants would have an idea of how to fill out the applications, what the program actually deals with, and then be able to follow up with me if there were any questions. So, the overview for today's session is that we're just going to do a brief background on the history of it, what the program actually entails. We're going to walk through some examples of past grantees, and then we're going to do an application walkthrough. And then at the end, I'm going to provide my contact information so that, again, if folks have questions, they can follow up with me directly, and I'm happy to answer any questions and allay any concerns or comments on the program. So to provide an overview of the seed grants program, the program itself was launched in 2014, and there have been allocations to over 50 organizations for their projects and over $250,000 in funding. And the seed grant program itself was set up to provide funding to community-based organizations in the City of Madison who are taking on neighborhood food access projects. So I wanted to give a brief overview of the timeline and then an explanation of the funding process itself. So it's important to understand kind of the approvals process that the seed grants go through. So there is a work group of the Madison Food Policy Council called the Seed Grants Work Group, and there are reviewers who are members of the Food Policy Council that review every proposal that we receive and then make recommendations on finalists who then provide a presentation to the reviewer group on their application and then answer questions from the reviewers to provide more clarity on that. Once those finalist presentations are over, the Seed Grants Work Group makes final recommendations, which then go to the Madison Food Policy Council, and that body then asks questions of the work group and the reviewers. An approval is made there, and then the final approval is actually taken up by the Common Council. And a brief timeline of that is that, apps are due in early March, they're reviewed, and then finalists are selected in mid to late March. And then final decisions are made and approved by the Food Policy Council in late March to early April, with final approval made by the Common Council in mid to late April. Now that process and the timeline, I should say, changes a bit from year to year just based on the schedule of the Food Policy Council meetings and the Common Council meetings, but for all intents and purposes, that timeline is pretty solid. It is indicative of the process that the seed grants actually go through. So for the contracting process, after the Common Council makes the final approvals, city staff, mainly myself, will work with grant recipients to go through the contracting process and make sure that everything is done correctly so that funds can be dispersed as quickly as possible so that organizations can actually get the funding and start their projects. So I wanted to just give an example of past grantees, or at least an example of some of the projects that we funded in the past. There actually is a document on the Seed Grants webpage. Again, the website link for that is on the opening slide of this presentation. You can also just Google Seed Grants City of Madison and it should take you to that page. But we do have a frequently asked questions document that actually has links to all of the over 50 projects that we funded in the past. But a brief example of some of the past grantees that the Seed Grants program has funded. Projects have ranged from supporting food pantries and helping them lower barriers to service for community residents by providing funds for refrigerators and things like that. There's also been funding for greenhouse education infrastructure to schools to support youth organizations, developing healthy food products and educating their youth on urban ag and production. There's been grants to organizations that are working with community gardens. So you can kind of see that there's a broad array of things that the seed grants actually fund, as long as they're applicable to food access and they serve City of Madison residents, and you can make an argument as to how that is happening. It is most likely an eligible project. Again, these grants were really created to be flexible and nimble to support the variety of food access projects that community organizations within the City of Madison are actually engaged in. So I wanted to give a brief application walkthrough and just highlight some of the key materials for the seed grants. So There is the application background letter itself, which provides information on the application process, the review criteria, some of the materials that also go into making funding decisions and that applicants should definitely look over prior to applying. And then I'll go over the application itself. And then the last thing that I'll touch on is the post-grant evaluation form, which grantees fill out and submit after their project is finished. I do also want to mention that the reason I want to do this, in addition to just providing some clarity on the application materials, is that back in 2018, the seed grants program materials actually went through a major revamp. And so for folks who may be accustomed or used to the program pre-2018, the application materials themselves have changed. So for the application background letter itself, again, as a part of the changes to the program, it's a bit shorter. It went from 2 pages to 1 page. And there's now a shorter bulleted list of priority areas that the proposals should address. And these really line up with the application sections and scoring form sections that reviewers use and applicants actually use when they apply and turn in their proposals. So we really tried, when we had the application background letter, we really tried to line that up very closely with what applicants actually see when they fill out their application materials and turn in final proposals. We didn't want to create a lot of ambiguity or confusion there, so we lined them up very closely. We also removed the requirement on using the Healthy Food for All short-term programs, policies, and actions matrix, which was included as a part of the Healthy Food for All community plan. Again, we did mention the Healthy Food for All community plan because it's a very helpful guide for project strategies and objectives, but we didn't tie any application to having to use things listed within that reports matrix. Again, this ties back to the idea of flexibility and being nimble on our part to allow community organizations to do what they need to do and what residents need within their communities. So for the application itself, again, changes to that actually made the application a bit shorter. It went from 7 pages to 6. It also, for the sake of the reviewers, in terms of really getting a sense of what the application is trying to get at before they jump into all of the minutiae and the details of an application, requires a short, less than 300-word cover letter to establish the project purpose. There had been in the past problems with kind of a vagueness when reviewers were actually reading through the materials, and so halfway through the application they were still not exactly sure what some proposals were trying to get at. So we took the guesswork out of that by requiring this cover letter. Additionally, the application sections themselves match up with the background letter criteria. I mentioned this when I was talking about the background letter itself. This, again, removes any ambiguity, makes it a lot easier for applicants and reviewers to go through this process. For the sake of transparency, the application section headers themselves break out the points per section, so you can kind of see the weights that the reviewers are looking at for each section. So if there's a 5-part section versus a 30-part section, it kind of lets you know that, maybe focus a bit more on that 30-part section and make sure that's a very strong application or strong component of your application, right? Because that's what's going to actually receive more points when reviewers score out these proposals. Additionally, in Part 3, it also puts an explicit emphasis on racial equity and social justice. This is very important to the city. We have the Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative. We want to make sure that the projects and programs that we're funding are really taking those considerations into account and really working with members of their community to understand what the implications of their project are from a racial equity and social justice perspective. And then there's also a section on evaluation. It requests goals and measures. These goals and measures that are recorded in the application itself are then used in the post-grant evaluation form, which is sent at the end of the grant period and really provides us a sense of what was accomplished and what the challenges were. I'll talk about that in just a moment here. So the post-grant evaluation form, as I said, was revamped during the 2018 changes to the program. The evaluation form retains certain components of the old evaluation form, really related to demographic and population served. Additionally, the form now references back, and I just mentioned this, back to the submitted application, so questions 9 and 10, which requests updated data on the stated benchmarks or the measures to achieve programmatic success and achieve the goals you set out in your application. This form actually, goes back, visits those components of your application and asks, did you achieve these things? And also, if you didn't, what were the challenges to achieving them, so that we at the city understand maybe what some of the barriers or obstacles you may have faced if you weren't able to achieve your goals. There's also a form included in this post-grant evaluation to address project and program sustainability. So, one of the things that the Seed Grants program was really set up to do was address these food access issues in neighborhoods around the city. But, sometimes organizations who are just starting off, are very grassroots, don't necessarily have the wherewithal or capacity to apply for very large grants. And then even some larger organizations who are starting new initiatives don't have the history or the evaluation benchmarks to justify funding for it. And so we saw the seed grants as being a place where these types of organizations and these new types of initiatives could come to get their seed funding, right, to get them off of the ground. And so to have an idea on the project program sustainability and how seed grants were maybe able to leverage additional funding or multi-year funding, as well as if this was the only source of funding, how necessary are then seed grants to continuing the life of the project and program that is started. So there's a section there because I think that is also very important for us at the city to know and to assess, especially if organizations do come back for repeat funding in out years. Some things to walk through, in terms of how reviewers look at the application and things that should really be on applicants' minds, is that this is a competitive grant process. I mentioned that to date, there's been $250,000 in funding dispersed. Each year, $50,000 is dispersed. Every single year, we always receive more funding requests than we have funding available. And so, we work with recipients to determine what project elements are most crucial to their mission and most crucial to the success of the project if we do have to trim budgets. But we also work maybe for applications that didn't necessarily make it to the finalist level or didn't receive seed funding. We also really try to work to ID other city funding sources as possible to suggest to pertinent applications. So just because you didn't get seed grant funding doesn't mean that you couldn't go and utilize other city grant programs, especially if we think you have a strong case to make that would apply for those grant programs. So we do try to provide other outlets and other routes for projects to take if they're not eligible or do not receive seed grants. So for projects rooted in community, projects that work collaboratively with neighborhood residents and groups and or which have gathered resident input to create their proposals receive priority. We really want to see projects that are rooted or housed in community. We don't necessarily want to see projects that the idea or the concept came up, but there was no method to vet whether a community wants or needs that project in their community. We really want to see organizations that have worked with community residents to figure out, is this something that folks want and need? Additionally, and maybe finally, the importance of funding and budgets is paramount, right? Budgets should line up with the requests that are being proposed and should also be logical and rational to viewers. So an example I like to use is if a proposal has a total budget or a project has a total budget of $4,000, but then has the overarching goal of providing healthy dinners to 15,000 families in the city for a 2-month period. I mean, that's not a realistic budget. That is something that's going to raise red flags for reviewers. And so you really have to think about, what is the budget that you're asking, what are the goals you're trying to achieve with your budget, and make sure that those two things line up and that your budget is in good shape and, again, makes sense to reviewers. So that's really all I have. Again, really wanted to record this so that folks and interested applicants could have a walkthrough of how to actually fill out the materials. And again, if there are any questions, I implore folks to go to the Seed Grants webpage. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there is a frequently asked questions document. and so that might help. If you still have questions or want to follow up directly with me, I have included my contact information here. So feel free to either email me or give me a call, and I'm happy to work with you on providing clarity and answering any questions you might have about the City of Madison seed grants. So I look forward to receiving your proposals for seed grants this year and in the years to come, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.